Okay, here's a demo to show how to work with raw files to edit, export, and archive for your digital portfolios. I've got a demo folder here, so I've just got 3 raw images of artworks here. I'm going to just work with one image to keep things simple here. If you click on these images, you'll get a preview, and you can choose which one looks like a good candidate. Sometimes they take a little bit longer to load here. This image looks like it has a decent composition, good place to start, so I'm going to start with that. I might be able to double click, or I can control click and make sure I'm opening this file with Adobe Photoshop. That's very important. When I open the file, you'll see here it opens in an environment called Camera Raw, right? I'm going to be working with the raw file. This tutorial assumes that you've been shooting raw images, and those are the kinds of files we're going to work with. Best file format for documenting artwork and creating an archive of your work. So in the Camera Raw environment here, we can edit a few important things. The first thing we're going to look at is white balance. So up here we can see the white balance settings are currently as shot in your camera. You may have set those properly in your camera, or you may not have, but the nice thing about RAW is we can adjust that here. So a good place to start looking at alternatives is to just select Auto, and the software will make some adjustments based on what it thinks looks good. That looks better than as shot. As shot looks very yellow. Auto is a little less yellow. I think that looks a little bit cool. I'm going to adjust the temperature slider here back up a little bit warmer. I think that looks good. Exposure, further down the list here, is another important setting you might need to adjust if you're overexposed or underexposed in your camera. You can make some adjustments here. This image does look a little bit overexposed when I'm at the 0 setting, which is how it was shot. Some of these white areas are pretty washed out, so if I slide this down a little bit, I might regain a little bit of detail in there. I'm losing some contrast, but I can fix that at a later step here. You can experiment with all of these sliders. Don't go too crazy. One thing that is often helpful is to come down here to the saturation and just bump that up a little bit to make the colors in your image a little more, to make them pop a bit more. You don't want to go too crazy with that here. I'm sliding this way up and really oversaturating things. But I can bump that up to, say, 10 or 15 and give myself a little more saturation. Close that. The curves command here, this can get complicated, but there's just a couple adjustments here that can be useful. Down here and up here, I've got 2 ends of this linear graph here. If I grab this, I can make some adjustments here. What I want to demonstrate here is just keeping this point all the way down at the bottom, but just sliding it over a little bit to the right. That can just make my darkest darks a bit darker. And then up here, I can do the same thing with my lightest lights. If I keep this corner all the way at the top of the graph, but I just slide it here to the left, it's going to make my brightest whites. It's going to make the brightest pixels in my image a little better. It's going to increase the contrast overall. Okay. So again, I don't want to go too crazy because I start to lose detail here if I slide that over too far. But just at each end of the spectrum, it is often helpful to compress that a little bit. Okay. Now I can crop my image here to get rid of some of this excessive background. And to do that, I'm going to, first I want to make sure I'm sticking to a standard ratio. So 5:7, 4:5, 2:3. You want to choose an aspect ratio that suits your image. 4:5 here looks pretty good to me. If you need to rotate it from landscape to portrait orientation, right, I can turn this vertical, horizontal, and still be at that aspect ratio. But here I'm at the 4:5 aspect ratio. I'm just going to stretch this cropping box until I get to a spot that is not too tight, not too loose in terms of the border around my image. I want the sculpture or whatever the artwork is to be, filling the frame, but not be too tight to the edges of the image like that. Here and here, that's a bit too tight. So I'm going to open that up and just center this. That looks pretty good. I'm going to hit return to set that crop. And then the last thing I want to do here is do some retouching or what's sometimes called healing. So here I want to make sure I'm choosing the healing type brush. You can see I've got a little circle here. I can adjust the size of that circle, so I can make it really big or really small. I think smaller is better for taking care of some of these dust spots. I'm going to enlarge my image here too, so hopefully y'all can see this a little bit better. So down here I can see all these little dust spots, and I can fix those with this tool. There's also a couple settings over here. One's called Visualize Spots and one's called Overlay. Overlay will show me where I'm fixing things. It will leave these little targets, which can be helpful. This other setting here, Visualize Spots, will temporarily render the image in this kind of high contrast thing, and I can adjust the threshold here, and it lets me see a little bit more clearly where the dust is. So right, with this setting on, the dust is really highlighted here. And now I can just go zap all those. Boom, boom, boom. And make my way through here. That looks pretty good. I can turn this off and see how I'm doing. Turn off the overlay to get rid of the targets. And there's an easy way to see what I've removed here. If I come up here to this little eyeball and just click and hold it, I can see the dust, and if I release, I can see what I've eliminated. So, easy way to see where the improvements have come in. Okay, so those are the main adjustments I want to make within Photoshop. And note that all of these changes are non-destructive, that is to say, reversible. And all of these changes are logged in what's called an XMP sidecar. I'll show you where that is in a moment. But once I'm satisfied with all of my various adjustments here, I'm going to come down to the bottom right and open this. And it's going to open that cleaned up raw image here in the standard Photoshop environment. And now I've made all my edits in RAW. I don't need to make any changes here. I just want to export this image as a JPEG at the size that's been determined by your instructor. And in most cases, that's going to be 1800 pixels in its longest dimension in JPEG format. So I'm going to come down here to export as. And then I just want to check some settings. I want a JPEG, that's where I am. I want the quality to be excellent. Here for the image size, I want to use 1800 pixels in the longest dimension. So I'm going to choose between the width and the height, whichever is longest. And I'm going to change that to 1800, hit return. The corresponding dimension should change so the proportions stay the same. I want to confirm that this is going to convert to sRGB. And then I'm going to export this. Okay, so now is the time where I need to name this file and also decide where it goes. Okay. The naming convention is going to be very specific to your course and your project. There's a separate document that should be furnished for your class that says what exactly your file should be named for a given project. Please follow those instructions exactly. For this particular project, the file, the designated project name is indefinite. I want to use an underscore, put my last name. And if I had more than one image, I would put an underscore and a number based on how many images I have. But in this case, I just have one image, so I can just do project name underscore my last name .jpg. And I'm going to put this in the same folder that I started with, which is the raw workflow demo. And I'm going to save that. Okay. Now, I can close this raw image that I opened up in Photoshop. It's going to ask me if I want to save. I don't need to save any changes because I didn't make any changes here in this environment. All the changes I made to the raw image are stored elsewhere, and I'm going to show you where that is. So I don't save that. I'm going to come back here to my folder, and here's the raw image I opened up, and you can see that there's a corresponding file here, the same number, but it's a .xmp. This is called the XMP sidecar, and all the changes I made in the raw environment are in that file. Why is that important? Well, what I can do, say I need a JPEG file of a different size. This is the size specified by the portfolio for my class at UMass. But say I'm applying to a grant and I need an image of this piece of artwork, but the grant application specifies a different pixel dimension. Say they want 2,500 pixels. Right? What I can do is just go back to this raw file. If I double click it, it's going to open back up in raw. And all those changes that I made are still here, right? You can see where I did all the retouching. I could do some more retouching, or I could hit this button and reset it and undo all that. But assuming I'm happy with the raw changes I made originally, I can just open it up here in raw, open it up again here in Photoshop, and then repeat this export process just like I did before. JPEG, excellent. But yeah, say I need a larger size. Instead of 1,800 pixels, I can say 2,500 pixels in the longest dimension. sRGB export. And now, instead of calling it that, I'm just going to call it that same thing, but I'm going to call it 2,500 just to remind myself that that's the bigger one. And save that. And now if I look here in my folder here, I've got my original export at 1,800 pixels in the longest dimension. And now I've got this bigger file, slightly larger image, 2,500 pixels in the longest dimension. Last thing I want to talk about here is archiving. So how do we keep track of all this stuff? You'll be uploading this exported file to Google Drive for the purposes of your class. But for your own purposes, you want to keep an archive of your work. Here's what I recommend. You want to create a new folder, and you can name this folder whatever makes sense to you. You can name it, if that artwork has a title, you could call this whatever that title is. If you want to just keep track of the work you did for a particular class at UMass in a particular semester, like R261, spring of 22, you could call it that, whatever makes sense. And then you just want to keep that raw file and the sidecar that accompanies it together. And that will now live together in this file. If you want to, you can also keep those exported JPEGs in there as well. And now you can always go back to this raw file. The changes that you made are here in the sidecar. You can always go back and tweak those changes. You can re-export in some other format or some other size. And this is an archive of your work that you can always come back to.